Boy returns from death with a horrifying message from Jesus. It was a bright Sunday morning, and the Whitley family prepared for a day like any other. The sun was shining, the air was crisp, and the world seemed at peace. Landon, an energetic and cheerful boy, was excited to spend the day at church with his parents. His mother and father were deeply religious, raising him in a household that emphasized faith, family, and love. For Landon, Sundays weren't just a routine. They were a time to connect with his parents and reflect on the teachings of their faith. The car ride to church was uneventful at first. Landon sat in the back seat, humming along to the gospel music playing softly on the radio. His parents exchanged light-hearted conversation in the front, planning their afternoon. But as they approached a familiar intersection, something felt off. A sudden tension, like the air had shifted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. In an instant, the peaceful morning shattered. A speeding ambulance responding to an emergency appeared out of nowhere. The vehicle collided with the Whitley family's car, the force of the impact crumpling the metal like paper. The sound of the crash was deafening, glass shattering, metal screeching, and the panicked cries of bystanders. When the chaos subsided, silence fell over the scene. Paramedics rushed to assist, finding the wreckage horrifying. Landon's parents were both unresponsive, and Landon himself showed no signs of life. The boy's small, fragile body lay limp, motionless, as if the spark of life had been extinguished. At the hospital, medical staff worked tirelessly. Every effort was made to resuscitate Landon, but the minutes dragged on without a pulse. After relentless attempts, he was declared clinically dead. His mother, devastated and clinging to the hope of a miracle, prayed fervently in the hallway, her voice trembling with desperation. But inside the sterile, fluorescent-lit room, all seemed lost. While Landon's body lay lifeless, something extraordinary was happening elsewhere. He would later describe feeling an almost magnetic pull, as if he were being lifted out of his physical form. It wasn't frightening. There was no pain, no fear, only a profound sense of calm and detachment. The chaos of the hospital room faded into nothingness, replaced by a warm, radiant light. The light grew brighter, enveloping him completely. It wasn't like anything he had ever experienced. It wasn't just a light, but a presence, alive, knowing, and overwhelmingly loving. As he moved toward it, he felt an indescribable peace, a reassurance that he was safe and exactly where he was meant to be. Colors more vibrant than anything on earth surrounded him, and an unearthly melody filled the air. It was as if the very fabric of existence was singing. Standing in the brilliance of this realm, Landon became aware of a figure approaching him. At first, it was a silhouette, but as it drew closer, the details became unmistakable. It was Jesus. His presence was commanding yet tender, his eyes filled with a love so deep that it seemed to encompass every corner of Landon's soul. The boy later said there were no words to adequately describe what it felt like to be in Jesus' presence. It was as though every question, doubt, and fear he had ever known vanished in an instant. Jesus didn't speak immediately. Instead, he looked at Landon with a gaze that seemed to pierce through time itself, as if he could see everything the boy had ever experienced and everything he ever would. Then Jesus spoke. His voice wasn't loud, yet it resonated through Landon's entire being, as though the words were being inscribed on his very essence. What he said wasn't comforting, it was urgent. "The time is near," Jesus told him. "You have been chosen to witness and warn." The weight of those words sank deep into Landon's heart. He didn't understand their full meaning at the time, but he knew they were important, world-shakingly important. As the message sank in, Landon felt the atmosphere shift. Images began to appear around him, not like a movie screen, but as if they were imprinted directly into his mind. He saw visions of the world, of people suffering, of natural disasters, of a growing darkness spreading across the globe. But intertwined with the chaos, there was also light. People praying, communities coming together, acts of love and kindness pushing back against the encroaching shadow. It was clear that the message Jesus had given him wasn't just a warning. It was also a call to action, a reminder that hope still remained. Landon wanted to stay in this realm, to bask in its peace and beauty forever. But as quickly as it had appeared, the light began to dim, and the world around him started to fade. He felt himself being pulled back, the warmth and serenity replaced by the harsh, sterile cold of the hospital room. His body, battered and broken, jolted back to life with a single breath, his lungs heaving as if they were drawing in air for the first time. He had returned, but he wasn't the same. What he had experienced was real, and the message he carried would change his life, and perhaps the lives of countless others, forever. Landon's first moments after returning to life were disorienting. His body ached, his head throbbed, and the sterile white lights of the hospital room felt glaring and cold compared to the radiant warmth of the place he had just left. Nurses and doctors surrounded him, their faces filled with a mixture of relief and astonishment. Against all odds, the boy who had been declared clinically dead was breathing again. But for Landon, the sensation of being alive again wasn't entirely comforting. He could still feel the echoes of the light, the peace, and the overwhelming presence of Jesus. He tried to speak, but his throat was raw, his voice barely a whisper. The medical staff reassured him, telling him he was safe now, that he had survived. Yet Landon knew the truth. What had happened to him wasn't just survival, it was something far greater. As the hours turned into days, Landon began to recover. His physical wounds slowly healed, but his mind remained consumed by the vivid memories of his time in the afterlife. The words of Jesus echoed in his thoughts. "The time is near. You have been chosen to witness and warn." He struggled to make sense of them. What was he meant to witness? Who was he supposed to warn? And why had he, an ordinary boy, been chosen for such an extraordinary task? One of the most profound aspects of his experience was what Jesus had shown him. Landon described it as a series of visions, each one more vivid and intense than the last. He saw images of the world's future, images that filled him with both awe and dread. In one vision, he saw cities consumed by fire, their skies darkened with smoke. He saw people crying out in desperation, their voices a cacophony of fear and sorrow. But amid the destruction, there were glimpses of hope. He saw people banding together, holding hands in prayer, their faith acting as a shield against the chaos. Landon also saw his own life flash before him, but not just the life he had lived. He saw a future, a path that seemed to stretch out before him, filled with moments of joy, struggle, and purpose. It was as if Jesus was showing him that his survival was no accident, that he had been brought back for a reason. The most chilling part of the experience, however, was the sense of urgency that accompanied it. Landon felt as though time itself was running out, that the world was on the brink of something monumental. And yet, Jesus' presence had also filled him with an unshakable sense of hope. The message wasn't just about impending danger, it was a call to action, a reminder that faith and love could overcome even the darkest of times. After the vision subsided, Landon found himself standing once again in the radiant presence of Jesus. The love and peace emanating from him were overwhelming, but there was also a weight to his words, a seriousness that Landon could feel in his very soul. "You must tell them," Jesus said. "You must share what you've seen." Before Landon could respond, the light around him began to fade, and he felt himself being pulled back into his body. The sensation was jarring, like being torn away from the most beautiful place he had ever known. As he gasped for air in the hospital room, he realized that his journey had just begun. The days following Landon's return were filled with questions. His mother, overjoyed by his miraculous recovery, couldn't stop crying tears of relief. She clung to him as if she might lose him again, her prayers of gratitude unending. But as Landon began to recount what he had experienced, her joy turned to a mixture of awe and bewilderment. At first, Landon struggled to put his experience into words. How could he describe the indescribable? The colors, the light, the voice of Jesus. It was all so far beyond anything he had ever known. But as he spoke, the memories came flooding back with startling clarity. He told his mother about the visions, about the warning he had received, and about the overwhelming love he had felt in the presence of Jesus. His mother listened intently, her hands trembling as she held his. She had always been a woman of faith, but hearing her son's account shook her to her core. It wasn't just that he had seen Jesus. It was the urgency of the message, the sense that something bigger was at play. She knew Landon wasn't making it up. The detail, the emotion in his voice, it was too real to be a fabrication. As Landon recovered, he began to share his story with others. At first, it was just close family and friends, but word quickly spread. People were captivated by his account, drawn to the sincerity and conviction with which he spoke. Some were moved to tears, their faith reignited by his words. Others were skeptical, dismissing his experience as a hallucination or a figment of his imagination. But Landon didn't let the doubters deter him. He knew what he had seen, and he knew it was too important to keep to himself. In the weeks that followed, Landon's life took on a new sense of purpose. He began to see his survival not as a stroke of luck, but as a divine mission. He felt compelled to share the message Jesus had given him, even if he didn't fully understand its implications. He started speaking at churches and community gatherings, recounting his experience with a mix of humility and urgency. His story resonated deeply with many, sparking conversations about faith, the afterlife, and the state of the world. But the weight of the message wasn't easy to bear. Landon often felt overwhelmed by the enormity of what he had been tasked with. He was just a boy, after all. How could he possibly make a difference in a world so vast and complicated? Yet, whenever doubt crept in, he reminded himself of the peace he had felt in Jesus' presence, the assurance that he wasn't alone. It was that memory, the memory of unconditional love and divine purpose, that kept him moving forward. Landon's life after his miraculous survival was anything but ordinary. Before the accident, he had been a typical boy, enjoying school, friends, and family outings. But now, he was no longer the same. His experience had marked him in ways that were impossible to ignore. People who saw him noticed something different, a deeper wisdom in his eyes, an intensity in the way he spoke about his journey, and an unshakable conviction that seemed far beyond his years. As Landon began to share his story, it quickly became clear that it had a profound impact on those who listened. His account was filled with vivid details of his time in the afterlife, details that seemed to resonate with people on a deeply personal level. Many who heard him speak were moved to tears, feeling a connection to his words that they couldn't quite explain. Some said it reignited their faith, while others described a newfound sense of purpose and urgency in their own lives. Landon's story began to spread beyond his immediate community. Churches invited him to speak at their services, where he stood before congregations and recounted his journey with a mixture of humility and passion. He spoke not as a preacher or a theologian, but as someone who had witnessed something extraordinary and felt compelled to share it. His honesty and vulnerability made his message all the more powerful, but not everyone embraced his story. There were skeptics, of course, who dismissed his account as the product of a young mind trying to make sense of a traumatic event. Others accused him of seeking attention or fabricating his experience. For a boy of his age, the criticism was difficult to bear. Yet, Landon remained steadfast. He wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. He simply felt a responsibility to share the truth as he had experienced it. The most transformative aspect of Landon's new life was the spiritual awakening that accompanied his experience. He began to see the world through a different lens, one that was deeply rooted in faith and compassion. He noticed the small miracles that often went unnoticed, the kindness of a stranger, the beauty of a sunset, the resilience of people facing adversity. For Landon, these moments were reminders of the divine presence he had encountered and the message he had been given. He also began to develop a deeper understanding of the visions he had seen during his time on the other side. The images of suffering and chaos, as well as the glimpses of hope and light, took on new meaning as he watched the events unfolding in the world around him. Natural disasters, political unrest, and societal divisions seemed to mirror the darkness he had been shown. Yet, he also saw the strength of communities coming together, the acts of love and generosity that shone like beacons in the darkness. It was as if the world itself was living out the battle he had witnessed, a struggle between despair and hope, fear and faith. Landon's story became a source of inspiration for many, but it also served as a stark warning. He often spoke about the urgency of the message he had received from Jesus. The time is near. He didn't claim to know exactly what this meant, but he believed it was a call for people to reflect on their lives, to seek out their own faith, and to come together in love and unity. He encouraged people to look beyond their differences and focus on the shared humanity that connected them all. As Landon continued to share his message, he couldn't help but notice how it resonated with the state of the world. The news was filled with stories of turmoil, natural disasters destroying communities, conflicts tearing nations apart, and a growing sense of uncertainty about the future. It was impossible to ignore the parallels between what he had seen in his visions and what was happening in real life. This only deepened his sense of urgency. One of the most striking aspects of Landon's story was how it bridged the gap between religion and spirituality. While his experience was deeply rooted in his Christian faith, many who heard his message found it resonated with their own beliefs, regardless of their religious background. Landon's story wasn't just about doctrine or theology. It was about the universal truths that connected all people, the importance of love, compassion, and the recognition that there was something greater than themselves. As Landon reflected on the chaos and beauty he saw in the world, he often returned to the words Jesus had spoken to him. They weren't just a warning, they were also a call to action. Landon realized that his story wasn't just about sharing his experience. It was about inspiring others to take action in their own lives. He encouraged people to live with intention, to strengthen their faith, and to be a source of light in a world that often felt consumed by darkness. Yet, the weight of his message was not easy to bear. Landon sometimes felt overwhelmed by the enormity of what he had experienced and the responsibility that came with it. He was still a boy, after all, navigating the complexities of growing up while carrying the burden of a divine mission. But whenever doubt crept in, he reminded himself of the love and peace he had felt in Jesus' presence. It was that memory that gave him the strength to continue, even in the face of criticism and uncertainty. As the years passed, Landon's story continued to touch the lives of those who heard it. People from all walks of life found hope and inspiration in his words, and many were moved to reflect on their own faith and purpose. For Landon, this was the greatest reward of all, to know that his experience had made a difference, even if only in small ways. It was a reminder that no matter how dark the world might seem, there was always light to be found. As Landon's story continued to gain traction, it began to intersect with larger narratives that captivated the public's imagination. One of the most unexpected connections people started to draw was between Landon's experience and the near-death incidents of high-profile figures, none more prominent than Donald Trump. The comparison, at first, seemed far-fetched, but the more people examined it, the more intriguing it became. Donald Trump, love him or hate him, has had a life marked by extraordinary survival and resilience. Over the years, he has faced situations that could have ended not only his career, but his very life. From reported assassination attempts and health scares to surviving intense political and personal scrutiny, Trump's ability to emerge unscathed seemed almost uncanny. To some, it was evidence of sheer determination. To others, it hinted at something greater, a higher purpose or calling. When asked about these parallels, Landon himself hesitated to make direct comparisons. After all, his experience was deeply personal and spiritual, while Trump's survival was rooted in the physical and political realms. Yet, he couldn't deny the pattern. Trump's ability to overcome seemingly insurmountable odds resonated with the idea that certain individuals might be chosen for a purpose larger than themselves. Landon, still grappling with the full implications of his own journey, began to wonder if Trump's repeated escapes from danger could also be a sign of divine intervention. Supporters of this theory pointed to moments in Trump's life that mirrored elements of Landon's story. Both had faced moments of profound danger, both had emerged stronger, and both carried a message, whether spoken or implied, that seemed to polarize and inspire people in equal measure. Trump's slogan, "Make America Great Again," became, in a way, a call to action, much like Landon's warning to prepare for a spiritual reckoning. But the comparison went deeper than politics. For those who believed in the connection, it wasn't about policies or elections. It was about the idea that some people are placed in positions of influence to guide others through challenging times. Trump's survival and perseverance, they argued, could be part of a larger narrative, one that aligned with Landon's message of urgency and spiritual awakening. Critics, of course, dismissed these connections as speculative and opportunistic. They saw Landon's story as a deeply personal experience that shouldn't be tied to the divisive world of politics. Yet, for many, the idea that two very different lives, one of a boy who had crossed into the afterlife and one of a man who had faced extraordinary odds, could intersect in meaning, was both fascinating and hopeful. It was a reminder that the universe, and perhaps God, works in ways that are often mysterious and interconnected. For Landon, these discussions reinforced his belief that his experience was part of something much larger. He didn't claim to have all the answers, but he knew that his journey, and Trump's for that matter, pointed to the idea that no one's life is random. Every struggle, every victory, and even every near-death experience might serve a purpose beyond human understanding. It was a humbling realization, one that motivated him to keep sharing his story, regardless of the controversies or comparisons it sparked. As Landon's message continued to ripple outwards, it became increasingly clear that his story wasn't just about him. It was about all of us, about humanity's collective journey and the choices we make in the face of uncertainty. Landon often spoke about the importance of looking inward, of examining one's own faith, purpose, and connection to others. His experience was a stark reminder that life is fragile, fleeting, and incredibly precious. Every moment, every action, every decision mattered. The urgency of the message Landon had been given by Jesus weighed heavily on his heart. He didn't fully understand what "the time is near" meant, but he felt its truth in the world around him. Wars, environmental disasters, societal divisions. These were all signs of a world in turmoil, a world in need of healing. Yet Landon's visions hadn't been entirely bleak. For every image of chaos and destruction, there had been a counterpoint, acts of love, kindness, and faith that shone brightly against the darkness. Landon began to see his mission not just as a warning, but as an invitation. It wasn't enough to recognize the challenges facing the world. People needed to rise above them. They needed to come together, to reconnect with their faith or spirituality, and to find hope in the face of despair. He encouraged people to pray, to seek out their own purpose, and to become beacons of light in their communities. Whether through small acts of kindness or larger efforts to bring about change, Landon believed everyone had a role to play. His story also forced people to confront uncomfortable questions. What if the time really was near? What would that mean for their lives, their choices, their relationships? For some, these questions sparked fear, but for others, they inspired action. People who had drifted away from their faith found themselves returning to it. Those who had grown cynical or complacent began to look for ways to make a difference. Landon's experience, as extraordinary as it was, reminded people of something deeply ordinary: the power of love, compassion, and connection. In the end, Landon's journey wasn't about answers, it was about questions. It was about challenging people to think, to feel, and to act. His story, though deeply personal, became a universal call to wake up, to pay attention, and to recognize the beauty and fragility of life. Whether they believed in his visions or not, people couldn't deny the impact his words had on their hearts and minds. As Landon reflected on everything that had happened, his accident, his time in the afterlife, and the years that followed, he often thought back to the moment when Jesus had spoken to him. The love in his voice, the power of his presence, and the urgency of his message were things Landon would never forget. They were the foundation of his mission, the source of his strength, and the reason he continued to share his story, no matter the challenges. Landon didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if the visions he had seen would come to pass, or if the world would heed the warning he had been given. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. His life had been changed forever, and his story had the power to change others. In the end, that was enough. It was a reminder that even in the face of uncertainty, faith, hope, and love could light the way forward.